All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Conversations with Dom, where we help guide your tech journey one story at a time. So, hey there, Tech Explorers. I'm your host, Dominic Gomes. Today, we're diving into everything in the tech universe, from mentorship to scaling your career. But before we kick off this interview, a quick request for everyone. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support lets us know what we're saying, that you like it, and what type of content you want to see more of. So let's jump into today's conversation. I've got a fantastic guest here, Tyrice Johnson from Oracle. A little bit of background. Tyrice and we met back, I would say back in 2022. We were both helping mentor Tamara, mutual connection of ours, and we've just kind of been talking ever since. We have a lot of interesting stories, and he's a very seasoned sales engineer too as well. So let's kick it off. Tyrice, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks, Dom. Yeah, it's been crazy how fast time flies. We're in 2024. We met 2022. But thank you, first and foremost, just for having me as a guest. And then thanks to all the folks over at, I'm Breaking Into Tech, because what you, KJ, Ali are doing is something I didn't have when I first started my career. And it's, crowdsourcing the best information from people, like wisdom, that's available for folks to learn from and just to be able to just get authentic experiences. So it's just really cool to be a part of something like this, honestly. So thank you guys.
Well, no, thank you for coming, and thanks for supporting us too as well. For anyone interested too as well, please reach out to any three of us, all three of us. We're happy to have guests to tell stories. But kind of getting that, let's hear a little bit more about you, Tyrice. Where you're from, where you live, and how you got started in tech.
Yeah, so originally from Brooklyn, New York, was born and raised out there, and did my undergrad degree down in North Carolina, mid-sized school out there, which was cool. And now I live out in Southern California, and my tech start was really the journey that got me to Southern California. So I broke into tech from this standpoint, back in 2013, which wasn't that long ago. But at the time, no one really knew, at least unless you were already in it, the pre-sales and solutions engineering world. And what happened was I was a public policy major. So up to a point, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. That plan pivoted for a lot of different reasons, but I knew that I wanted to. One of the reasons I looked at tech at that time was I definitely wanted to make great money, student loans, and money's important, right? And then also realized that I knew tech would be something, even back then, that the more things evolved and changed, it's always just going to be a center part of people's lives. So I was like, man, if I could really sink my teeth in something that allows me to learn, I can grow, make great money, and it'd be great. Well, my opportunity came up in a funny way. So my senior year, I have a class about emerging technologies, and we basically just, Twitter, which is now X, we would look at following trends online. And the trend I followed was how do consumers and technologies connect. So at the time, how all this connects to Oracle, which is where I got my start, they had just bought a company called Vitro and Evolver for my tech bets. And what that would do, those products were focused on social media listening. So it's kind of funny because now the thought of your brand being mentioned and you not knowing about it, no one would even imagine of. But back then, I might be dating myself a bit, but the folks that remember United Breaks Guitars and how viral that went, well, United was some of the last people to hear about it. So they learned from that, and a lot of other companies did like, hey, we don't want to be on the tail end of going viral, especially if it's a negative thing. So anyway, those products were kind of focused on that. I didn't know too much about them. Oracle ends up at a career fair of mine, and I asked who ends up being one of the solutions engineering managers, like what made Oracle want to buy those two companies? And he and I start chatting, connecting. He says, we should grab coffee. Like I got to run to go talk to some candidates, but you're an interesting guy. You don't have a tech background. You don't have a sales background, but you got enough potential that we should see maybe where there's a fit. Yeah, I'm a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed college senior. So you said, let's go coffee. And I'm just like, whatever this process looks like, let's go.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Let's go.
So going in there, I get coffee, and what was cool that maybe a lot of people can relate to was, the manager called out the direct things I didn't have. I didn't have tech experience. I didn't have a sales background. And from the things I did do, it was more higher ed focused. So they didn't have higher ed roles there. So on paper, like, well, what do you have if you don't have those things there? And I basically sold them on like, I'm a fast learner and I can pick up things well. And, he gave me a shot, and that transformed into getting into pre-sales. And so that's where I've been for the past decade, through different companies, Oracle being one of the main ones, Salesforce another, Anaplan is another company that focuses on planning. So I've been through those three, companies, but that's how I got my start. It was really a conversation, coffee, had the chance to interview. It was a pretty grueling interview process, but did well enough that they gave me a shot and just haven't looked back since.
Wow, that's inspiring. We do have something in common there. I studied political science, and I thought I was going to be a lawyer too. And I decided to be like, I want to make money. I don't need any more school right now. But you bring up a lot of good points too, where you didn't have the skills, but you had that tenacity and you had that grit to really just go out and make them know that you're right for this role. Through the interview process, when you had that first role with Oracle, what was that like? Did they make you do a demonstration? Did you have to learn a product, or was it more of a presentation? Love to dive a little bit more deeper into that.
Yeah, it was intense, man. And here's why I'll say that. We live in a different era now where there's more things focused on doing stuff virtually like this. Back then, there was no virtual. I mean, WebEx could only do so much, and the video quality at the time isn't what we're at now. So I did an on-site, and it was 8 hours of interviews. And so some of the things that I walked through then that I could tell, helped me, because it really shows like where companies put their trust in. So I had about 6 hours of one-on-one style interviews, and it was boiler room style. I'm just going to tell you, like, sell me this pen. And I'm sitting across the table from a solutions director that had about 20 years of experience in the field. And again, I'm a 19-year-old college student, not college senior. But very quickly, I learned, nope, you're not a college student. Actually, let me take a step back from that. So the interviews that I did, they flew us out for, and it was to Dallas. So we have a dinner that night. I'm not realizing the dinner is also part of the interview. One of the things I had to learn was kind of starting to pick up things quickly. Anytime you're in an outing that's related to people who might hire you, even though they're not directly interviewed, they're indirectly interviewing you. And so they were checking, do you work a room? Do you like introduce yourselves to people? I'm much more introverted. I'd rather like build 1 or 2 great conversations with people the whole time than introduce myself to everybody. But I had to get out of my comfort zone. So I had to do that. Not realizing that was also them evaluating, like, how are you going to be around people? But there was that. Then the actual day of the interviews, it was 6 hours one-on-one, people asking you to sell me this pen. People asking, like, if you were to get the role, walk me through some of these situations that you would handle. And, of course, you're kind of debating what level of detail you should go through, because the funny thing about interviews, especially if you don't have a background in tech like I did, was you're trying to figure out what's relevant from your own background. And at the same time, you don't want to seem like you are inexperienced, right? Because they're looking at stuff they relate to. But so you got to walk that line really well in connecting both those worlds together. So I had good practice. I mean, but it was intimidating to some degree because all these guys are 20, 30 years my senior. Even had a guy once like, man, my son's older than you. And so you don't know at that time, like, how to handle those things. And then to top it all off, at the end, you've got to do an in-person demo. So I was at a podium doing an in-person demo, and I want to say there was about 9 or 10 of those guys in the room. And so I always say, like, presenting to customers is a lot easier for me because internally, all of those guys had 20 to 25 years of pre-sales experience, and they were hitting you with questions just to see how you would respond. And so that I learned a lot from that, because even though it was intense, the best thing I saw from it was they just wanted to see if you get rattled. Because if you do and you're in front of a customer, it's not about giving the best answer. They just want to make sure that if you're calm and you're confident, they trust what you want to share. Even if it's, hey, I don't know the answer to that question. Let me write that down. Let me get back to you. But it was also awkward too. Like, one of the pieces of feedback I got was, for guys that would present in person, the T-Rex arms. So you try to like, if you're presenting with your hands, exactly. All right. You want to do this, be relaxed. And I'm like this, so to speak, like I'm still in an imaginary podium. Cause I was like kind of frozen, but we don't do that as often now with in-person being kind of more of a luxury than a necessity. But man, 19 years old behind a podium, looking like not scared, but scared inside. And it was good, but that was the interview process, man. So.
Wow. And it's funny you mentioned that because it's really crazy to look back, over 10 years, how much it's changed. Because I did my first in-person interview and first in-person demo about a month ago. And
Nice.
I was so rusty. I was like, I don't remember what this is like, but because we're so easy, you have your multiple screens, but then when you just take your laptop out there and then you're plugging into a projector, it's just a totally different dynamic. But it's interesting to see how, even though we have been used to this remote world, there is a little bit more desire of people going on site a little bit more lately. And it's exciting. It's frankly refreshing. But I have to say that as a 19-year-old, like I give you a lot of credit, man. Like that, I would have probably been a little bit, well, you were nervous, like you said, but I mean, that's a lot, especially internally. I would say it's so much harder to demo to your peers than it is to the customer most of the time, because they're going to really just throw you with every objection you possibly can think of, even the worst ones you could ever think of.
Totally, man. And hey, like I did one 6 months ago. I was like, man, we were rusty. But once you get back into it, I just like, oh wow, I remember why it was so important. Cause like you said, there's a desire for it, because on one hand, what I've seen is like people, if you can only have virtual, it's like you work with what you have. But if you can do in person, you feel people's energy, you get to shake hands. Like there's something about that just kind of builds a different connection. Here's what I will say that's underrated about virtual. You got to really learn how to communicate when you're on virtual, because in person, like you could get away with certain things because you were connecting in the room. People get Zoom fatigue. So if you're like doing too much in one presentation or trying to fit too much at one time, you'll lose people, because people have like such an attention span now that they're looking for like, key points, key things. So I appreciate it, but yeah, it was different. It was definitely a different time, man. And it was, these guys had the intention of, let's try to see if we can get them. And, it was just as hungry people back then too. I think I was with 8 or 9 folks. And at that point, there wasn't as much information available online. So you also had to kind of like really dig to find stuff, because if they hit you with an objection, they would act like you already knew the software. And I'm like, man, the most I could find was this PowerPoint from like 7 years before. I don't even know if it's still relevant now, but we're going to go with it. So it was different times.
Well, I think the difference, and I was talking about this the other day, when you're doing demos virtually, what I like to do is, if you have done the good, proper discovery beforehand, you understand what the stakeholders care about. And when you're going to show something, I just call them out by name and be like, hey, so-and-so.
So good.
You told me this. You're going to get a kick out of this. Like, this is going to save you a lot of time. You're going to love this. But stuff like that in general, I agree. That's how I felt when I was in person about a month ago, where there was things that I probably could have done a little bit better, but because I was there and people kind of get the energy of everyone being in there and there's excitement, you feel like you're building working relationships, that they're a little bit more forgiving if something doesn't work right. Which will happen all the time. Like stuff man. Never turns out.
Oh my gosh, man. Totally true. That's actually really good for anybody to learn, like whether it's an interview or a demo. When you call people out by name, it's almost like they're like doing their thing and like, oh, they're talking to me. And it just makes people feel like you know them, you care about them. So that's really cool too. And yeah, you do that. It also like, I remember one thing my first manager told me was, like, actors have to go through this when they're learning improv, is they'll have a scene, and then let's say the scene part of it was opening a door. They would set up actors where the doorknob would not be there. So then it's like, oh crap, now what do you do? And you have to learn how to like improvise and roll with it. And at least as SCs, we could be like, something's not working well, but you kind of start learning like, calm down, don't panic. Like, let's just try to figure this out. but let them know like, hey, we're just experiencing some technical difficulties. You know, being at Zoom, you get the easy one. Oh, the internet's messing up. Hold on a second. And if you need to like dart the meeting to like fix stuff, boom, you come back.
Well, yeah, I think that's the thing is things will happen, but people get it, right? Like we're humans,
Yeah.
right? You know, technology is technology. It is what it is, but it's how you sell it. It's how you connect the problem to your solution. And sometimes, you know, like unfortunately, things don't work out. Like it's happened to me all the time. Like a report's not running. You're like, huh, you can even a little bit of self-deprecating humor goes a long way of just like, oh, this never happens, right, guys?
Yep.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
so
Well, the
good.
other thing that I would say, and again, like since we're talking about the subject of when people throw objections to you, like I learned this great trick that I'll just explain a little bit on here since we're
Yeah.
talking about it. Since I think at Zendesk we had this model that we called the 4 Ps. So it'd be they they give you an objection instead of you just instantly jumping in and saying something, you pause. So you
Yeah.
just pause. Might be a little bit awkward at first because maybe you want to just instantly jump in, but it's actually giving you some time to think
Yeah.
about what the question is. And then the second P is you paraphrase. So
Yeah.
you say, "Oh, so you're telling me that you want the system to do X, Y, Z. Is that right?" Then if you don't have a solution, you probe. So you ask more questions.
Yeah.
So you try to understand more about the request, and then that's actually just buying you more time to come up with a well-formed answer. And then
Yeah.
if you have an answer, the fourth P is prescribe. So you go in and you explain what the solution is, or if you have a good answer. If you don't have a great answer, then that's when you pretty much write down what your action item is, and you're saying, "I'm going to follow up with you on that."
Yep.
But it's more of just a way to think about how do I deal with a potential objection that comes up. Which again, it's always cool to talk with another SE just around
Yeah.
this type of stuff. But aside from going into that, let's dive a little bit more in your background. So you were at Oracle, right? And I'm just like
Yeah.
looking at your so you started off doing marketing. Was it marketing solutions when you were at Oracle to begin with, or did you end up doing a different type of technology?
Different type of technology. So where I started was Oracle had this program kind of similar to what a lot of people are trying to break into now, like the almost like an associate's program. And they gave us 2 routes. You could either take marketing or another solution set called sales performance management, which to simplify it, is just anytime you get paid bonuses or commissions, there's systems that make that. And then when people get their goals in their territories, there's systems that make that stuff. So when you put those together, that's sales performance management. They do it for sellers or salespeople. They'll do it for like third-party partners and everything in between. So interesting thing was like I was going to lean more towards marketing at that time. A friend of mine who I met through the program was like, dude, you got to do this solution set. And I was like, man, this seems intimidating because it's numbers, there's a lot of math, you're dealing with finance people. Best decision I made, because kind of find out it was half of it was really more psychology. The other half was the numbers, but ended up in that solution space. And it was a niche, so it was really cool. But yeah, started at Oracle, focusing on what they called their sales performance management solutions. And that's how I marked most of my career. I pivoted into marketing when I went to Salesforce. But I would say majority of my career has been what they call SPM.
Which is fascinating. And for people who don't understand SPM, to your point, you're going to be checking that system if you're in sales land constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And my guess is the biggest thing that you are selling on to folks, both I guess the sales comp people, but then also sales people, is like you want to have trust in the system, because if you're not getting paid out what you think you're going to get paid out and you don't believe it, that's going to lead to attrition for sales reps, which is always a huge problem in the tech industry.
So true, man. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. When there's no trust, what'll happen is, I mean, it's just like normal human beings would. Like if you imagine you're supposed to get X amount on a check and you're shorted some money, even if it's a few dollars, you're kind of start now second guessing, like, wait a second, let me run the math real quick just to make sure now I'm not looking over my shoulder. And so when you do that, you still have the same amount of time in the day as the next person. So your productivity is going to drop. And that's what companies start to see, is like either you don't trust enough, so you'll leave and go elsewhere, or you're always going to be, as a part of your day, what they'll call shadow accounting, where you've got your own calculator to make sure when you get paid, like, did they short me again? If they did, by how much, right? Or the flip happens, which nobody talks about, which I always find funny. People get overpaid. You'll never hear any drama about that.
Until you get that claw back. Yeah.
Right. Or people, depending on how big the overpayment is, sometimes when you see on LinkedIn, like, oh, so-and-so left so early. And you're like, oh, what wonder what happened. They got a big overpay day. And you're like, nope, don't got to pay it back if I go to another company. So that happens like more often than you think. But yeah, you're so right. And that's what companies are trying to figure out is like, how do we keep the trust going with your sellers, whether they're SCs, salespeople, customer success, like anybody that's measured on some form of an incentive or goal. That's what they're trying to figure out because they don't want the turnover. They want the productivity. And then we all don't like change, right? Let's just call that out. So anytime companies shift focus, buy new products, acquire stuff, there's always this air of like, do I really want to touch that or sell that? So you got to incentivize people to make it attractive enough to then want to learn enough to then go sell this stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, and for folks that are on here, you've probably heard terms like clawbacks, or you'll hear things like accelerators. For that, like, you know, a clawback for viewers here is if you sold something and let's say that the customer doesn't pay the invoice or ends up canceling, you get paid commission, but a clawback means they are literally clawing it back. They are taking it away from you. So you basically, a lot of times they put you in a situation where any net new commissions that you get are sort of to pay off the hole that you put yourself into because of the clawback.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's like when you play Monopoly and you pick up that card, says, oh, you got like a random tax bill you got to pay out. That's what a clawback is like. So it's never fun for anybody to be in that position. It does happen though, for sure.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. So, you know, just even looking more at your career, I think an interesting thing I would love to chat about is like, so you went to Oracle and it looks like you've term that we hear a lot in the industry too is a boomerang.
Boomerang.
Right? You boomeranged twice, right? And boomerang just means I leave a company and I come back.
Yeah.
What was that experience like? Because I've boomeranged before too in the past, right? And sometimes it just makes sense, you know?
Yeah, sometimes it does, man. You know, so I think here's what I will say too, because maybe this can help some folks of maybe why boomerang, why even leave in the first place. So the first time I would say it was super tough because you never had left a company before. You hear a lot of different stories, like if you leave, you don't want to leave on bad terms, because obviously you never know. And the funny thing about tech, that world is really small. So somebody through, you know, connections will know someone that you know. And I think the reason why I left the first time, you know, and Oracle is aware of this too, is that, you know, back then, what's so fascinating about these programs was the expectations people have always would vary. So my team, and I'll say where it helped me, and then also like how it translated into leaving, was we were a part of a group that were all hired as brand new SCs. So either all of us graduated from grad school with a business degree or some form of, you know, grad degree, or you're just out of undergrad. And SPM at that point wasn't as well known. So even though we were at this huge company, we were like a startup within a huge company. And we were also out to prove ourselves that we belonged because we were the youngest and we were the most inexperienced. So what they didn't expect, we kind of had a mark of maybe 2 years before we closed our first deal. There was 12 of us on the team. All of us had closed at least two deals before the end of our first year. And so they were kind of like, wow, these kids are a little different. And for me personally, I think I blew out my number my first year in tech, second year and third year in tech. So it was interesting to see like, whoa, like you kind of start having your confidence grow because you've built some success there. And so now what happens that wasn't as, you know, normal is you start hearing about like, okay, some peers are leaving and because they're getting these different packages and offers at other companies. And we're like, wow, like, should we leave? Should we stay? And every company is different. You know, at that time, Big Red wasn't really doing as much promotions. And so, and if it was kind of more of a wait your turn. And for some folks who want to stay, it's no problem. For me, it was like, all right, well, my growth potential is only going to be so limited where even if I get promoted, there's only so much I could get promoted. And sometimes it does make more sense to leave to a competitor because the pay packages are much larger than they were if you stay. And you're kind of measured by, well, let's give them a 10% raise or a 10% bump. I was the lowest paid guy in my cohort. I would later find out through different measures. So For me, it was like starting out, I want to say with OTE was maybe 100, or supposed to be. But 60 of that was base. So it was like, wow, like, all right, man, I got one promotion, cool. But when a company says, well, we'll do like 60K more than what you make now, I'm like, oh, well, that's different compared to hearing, it's such a struggle at the 100K. So that prompted part of that leave the first time. And then to go back was, okay, the startup culture life, kind of where I hit my head against the wall on is I like sports. So my analogy is, most companies operate like teams. You play a game, if it's basketball or football, there's 4 quarters in the game. Game's over, you reassess, you go forward for the next game. When you're in startup mode, it's a never-ending game. You'll go from 4 quarter to overtime 1, overtime 2, overtime 3, and it feels like every quarter is like Q4 again. And so for, on one hand, like you got to be mindful of your mental to make sure you're recharging, because the expectations are going to stay high for a long time. And then 2 is the workload is immense because they're in a growth stage. So if the owners of that company are like trying to show we're, to be bought, or, we're trying to be acquired, or we're trying to still scale, like they're wanting to keep momentum by any means necessary. And so when you're selling in that environment, it's a lot of time invested. So for me, I was at a different season in my life where I did enjoy what I did work-wise, but I didn't want to live to work, and that's something I had to realize, that I'd accomplished a lot, did really well, started having multiple sources of income also, which was awesome. So I didn't feel like I needed to just stay in that environment for money reasons. It was like, all right, we got to look at the whole picture here and see what's there. Oracle was a different type of speed where they were more seasonal. So I knew there would be heavy seasons, but I knew when they were coming. So that was that first boomerang. And then the other ones later just became, looking at the full picture. I always tell people, when you're working for a company, it's a partnership, because on their side, especially in the whole sales comp space, like they're evaluating, can they make a return on investment by hiring you? And preferably they want to make a lot more, obviously. So from your end, at least what I would say is be authentic. Love, I enjoy who I work with, and that's a part of that investment. But I've got to also look at like the whole picture, right? There's Dom Incorporated, right? Or the Gomes family incorporated, and there's a Johnson family incorporated. So I got to look and see, like, for us as a household, like what makes the most sense for us to do. And as long as that partnership stays good and makes sense, let's keep doing it. If that changes, long as I understand the whys behind, yes, let's go for it. Even boomeranging back, same thing. Let's look at the whys behind it. Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? So yeah, it's my second time boomeranging back at Oracle. It made sense. But it made sense, So I think the best tip I can give for people around that is just don't over emotionalize it. I think that was one thing I did the first time, that you felt like you were abandoning people and leaving people. You're not leaving, like you're not dying. People know people, they know you. You'd be surprised at how your paths cross again in different stages in life, but your community is your community. Where you get your paycheck from is a whole different story. So, yeah.
Well, you bring up good points, is that there's times where you're just going to feel stuck, and a move makes the most sense. Especially, I had a situation with one of the companies where I got brought in, but I was at the top of the pay band, and I couldn't get to that next level. Like there just was not promotions. So I was stuck. So me trying to move forward or make any progress monetarily, which, again, it is the balance between, well, what do I and my family need, outside of work, but then also monetarily, like what are our goals? And it made sense to look somewhere else because for the amount of work I was doing, I felt like if I don't see a path forward of where I could go, like, all right, well, let me see what else is out there. And sometimes it's not even looking. Sometimes it just happens. But you bring a key point where it's all about leaving on good terms too. Like, yeah, it's never easy to leave. You can get a little emotional about it because, again, you're going to feel like you're letting people down. Yeah. But then when you talk to your managers and people like that, they get it because they've done the same things before too as well. Especially if you're like our generation, the idea that, and we've had this, I think it was the first conversation we had, right? Is like every 2 years you should be thinking, right? I'm either trying to potentially progress my career either through a promotion or at least, make more money or gain some new skills. Yeah. If you feel like you're just stuck and complacent, And again, complacency is fine if that's what you want. But if you feel like you want to learn more, then instead of just sort of stewing it and just saying this is the best it can get, like that's not the way to look at it. Is like you can make your decisions. Like you're really the master of 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 your destiny, essentially, where you want to go. It's all about your own decisions.
Oh, totally. And I think what people confuse to something you said, there's a difference between being content and complacent. Like
Exactly.
you could be content with where you're at, and it may not make sense to move, and that's totally fine. Where you don't want to be, especially in this environment, like you said, if people want to, I'm not saying that they, can't. We're all human beings. I just don't recommend being complacent. You can't expect that you're not going to have to develop a new skill set or be exposed to something different. Gone are the days where like I'm only focused on SPM and like that's it. You can develop an expertise, but you have to always be mindful of how what you do connects to what's happening in the world around you. And you are right. You should come up after a couple years and see, because on one hand too, we don't want to, like, it's crazy. We live in this environment where, because everything comes so quickly, I think people sometimes have unrealistic expectations on mastery. So yeah, being focused for a couple years in your space and doing really well and getting exposure, really, it helps. So that when you come up, you're like, all right, how are we doing? Can we keep growing in this area? If so, where are the opportunities? If it's not there, like you said, we might need to pivot. And that's cool. Like it's you're just learning where you can be best fit. And if you don't have to move, that's all good too. You can be content with that. It's making sure that you just have an awareness, because so much stuff, as and I feel like every person in tech has been told this, you're going to have to keep learning. Every time you think something is so cool and chill, it's like something always changes up. And then we're all still in this place of like learning as we go. Like people knew AI was big. The degree is big now. We're all still understanding. So who knows like how that all shakes out in this stuff, just as one example. But yeah, I definitely recommend folks to do what you did. Like evaluate, see where you're at, see where the goals are. If things are not happening and there's no game plan, let's have one. If not, then you know where you need to start, so to speak. So I think that's super sound advice.
Well, and you bring it up too. It's about acquiring new skills, but it's more about how you acquire the skills, like having the skills to learn skills versus like I'm deep in a skill. Like for example, APIs, right? People think, oh, I gotta like write a bunch of code and I have to know how to do all this stuff. You don't have to. You can learn just how to talk to them, understand basic JSON structures, and open up Postman and show what a sample API call is. You don't need to do the full thing, but to be able to intelligently talk through it, explain how it works, are things that I think people should learn, especially if you're in a technical space like us, like because everything works via APIs nowadays. But shout out to KJ. KJ's always talking about being technical. Go subscribe to his content too as well. But just wanted to throw that out there. But it's the skills to learn skills is what people need to learn, essentially.
Totally, man. And especially in this day and age, I mean, having somebody like KJ with his technical expertise, like that's cool. What you didn't have, right? You had to find people who, like, what I always say, how you know someone's really good at what they do, they can teach it in the most simplest way. And when you can do that, that's how you know you've got real good mastery of what you're talking about. And so the technical stuff, especially for folks looking at, I remember one thing, his name is Michael Rich. He's a really cool guy. He was my manager at Salesforce for a while. He gave this kind of paradigm of when you're in technical sales or just tech in general, there's a spectrum of like strong technical skills and strong sales acumen. And there are going to be roles that require you to be more on this end, some are on this end, some in the middle. But what you always want to do is kind of make sure your goal is to keep moving up on both. And like you said, how you get those skills, sometimes it's going to be through exposure in a role. But when you don't have the exposure in the role, having the KJs of the world or having resources where they know and they're willing to give you insight, that's where you want to go to, because those people know, hey, why is this important to a client? That's always my question, right? To your point, why would somebody even show like a sample API call? Because honestly, the customer's trying to figure out, man, if we move, can I do this? Okay, if Dom just did it, and Dom's like technical, but he's not to the point where I feel like I can't keep up with him. Well, if he did it, then I can do it. So there's belief that grows from that. So I'm like, oh, well, if that's why the customer cares about it, and you can explain why that's important. Or maybe there's, a more technical guy in the audience and he's thinking, is my life going to be crazier if we bring in this new software with how we currently do things? Then things start to sink in a little bit. Sometimes you can figure that out on your own. And I know that's a lot of promoted today, like through different avenues. I think what gets underrated is relationships. If you can learn from people, that helps you. That's like a time saver. Because they know not only the what, but they also know the how and the when to help put these pieces together too. So,
and I think you bring up a good point, right? Is you always hear the whole thing: do I be a generalist or do I be a specialist? I feel like in our role, you have to be more of a generalist because you need to be able to glance the top of it. But if you don't need to go deep, you can always try to find the person who is the person who can be deep. Like there's typically in sales organizations, right? Like good example, I just had to do this. You have a security questionnaire. At a cursory level, you can look at it and you can do things, but normally there's a team that focuses on that. You could explain, like you're always going to hear the same questions. Is data encrypted at rest and in transit, right? Like things like that. Oh, do we have our ISO certifications? Here's the trust center. But if someone's getting deep into the weeds, you don't necessarily need to be the person who knows all those details because it doesn't serve your purpose in what you're trying to do. But a lot of times in this role and in tech, it's just really about connecting the dots to the right resource.
100% agree, man. And I'll say this even as like my role is more of a specialist. You still should be a generalist, even as a specialist, because like you said about connecting dots. I love that. Like sometimes I would hear a lot, and it's the game people always don't want to be caught in is you don't want to be a mile wide and a knee deep, or you don't want to be like 10 miles deep, but only a mile wide. So then people are like, crap, like how do I balance both? It's how you learn to connect dots. Sometimes you might need to go deep. Sometimes you might need to stay wide, but can you just connect? Because if you don't make the connections, the customer isn't going to either. So like that piece to me is fun and yeah, with our space, things are evolving and you want to be versatile. I don't look at it like when you're an SC, you have to worry about the whole jack of all trades, master of none thing. It's more of, how versatile can you be? Do you understand how this web of things fits together? Do you get how what you're selling fits in the broader space of what these companies are trying to solve for? Because they've got to figure out all of that too. And how, like you said, how you acquire that, you're going to get exposure. One thing I tell people who are newer in the space, at least what helped me, is I took every opportunity I could. So I ended up developing expertise in a lot of stuff, just random. It was like, oh, there's a media and entertainment use case. That's interesting. Here's a travel use case. Here's a manufacturing use case, kind of things from all over. And so if people have that, sometimes there's the fear of like, well, I don't know enough to be effective in that. That's how we all had to learn. And you just pick up things as you go. And it's funny, I've taught some customers stuff that'll work well in one industry. They'd have no idea that works well in their industry. Also, I do because I've just learned how to connect the dots, like you said. So
yeah, I agree. I want to pivot the conversation a little bit over to, I think, just let's talk about. I would love to get your thoughts, just because again, you were in a program that kind of got you on this track, but nowadays, again, we're seeing less of those sort of opportunities.
Yeah.
What's your point of view on someone who's starting from scratch? How you potentially get eventually to our role? Because again, there's boot camps, there's things out there. But again, I've had a lot of people reach out to me saying they're just not seeing the opportunities, and I'd be kind of curious to understand, like, what advice would you give them to eventually get there, knowing that it's a path?
Yeah, knowing it's a path, right? So I think the one biggest thing, even for me personally, I look at is just a willingness to develop relationships. And my biggest take on that is when you reach out to people, have things you want to learn from them. You may not have to have all the answers, but what I do see, especially in our space, and I've had people ask me like, well, how do I separate myself from a bunch of other people asking? And I'm like, well, take things from transactional or relational. I can't go to a customer and just say, you should just buy our stuff. I got to build a bit of a, like you said, discovery relationship, kind of figure out where I can help them. Well, on our end, we got a lot of, wisdom we could share. So of course you can subscribe to the podcast, right? Breaking in Tech and learn. But when you're talking those one-on-one relationships, look at the person and start looking through enough to ask a question that sparks conversation, and then just take the time to learn. People will be surprised how that builds enough trust with someone to say, yes, if there is something that comes up, I'm going to keep you in mind. And I always tell people why is because for you and I and the rest of the folks that are practicing, we've got a reputation too. If we just go around internally recommending 1 million people and folks are like, here comes another one of Dom's specials or Tyrice's specials, that puts us in an awkward spot because it's like, I want you to break in, but then I can't really vouch for anything that you brought to the table just yet. So to me, like that builds those building relationships allows people to vouch for you, and getting to know a person makes it to where you're not just hitting me up because you want a referral. You want to learn some things, and maybe there's something I've done that I can help you. Right. So I think that's one side of it to break in, because you're just going to need it. I think on another sense, it's, when you do get those interviews, one thing and I'm taking this from personal experience, like I was a college senior. On paper, people would look at it and say, how in the world does what you do relate to being a sales engineer? And I had to help these peers of 20 plus years, my senior C connections. And the second thing is just connecting the dots for people, like you talked about. I helped them understand that a tour guide in college is a sales rep. When parents come in and say, do we want to invest $40,000 a year, 50, whatever the case may be, I'm a customer and a sales rep simultaneously. So they're looking at me saying, you go here. What's your experience? And I've got to be objective enough, or chose to at least, to say, while I'm giving you this tour, this has been my firsthand experience. If your child comes here, this is what I think they'll have access to. And for my tours, probably a good third of the people who went on them ended up enrolling in the university. They're like, oh, it's pretty good numbers. Would they have naturally done that? No. So for people breaking in the space, I try to help them learn too. You've got to do the homework of translating your experiences from what you do to what they're used to. Yes, we are sales engineers. The joke sometimes I tell people though is that there are a handful of folks that they're so much in their space, they don't know any other spaces. So they're not going to automatically connect, oh, you worked in retail, or oh, you were an actor, or oh, you were this or that. I'm just naming career paths I've seen some of my peers start in and then pivot into tech. You've got to make that bridge. So when you do have those opportunities, help them see where your value is. So I'd say that's number 2. And then number 3, obviously plug into the resources you can to upskill. But I do think that you're going to find some routes that work really well for people and some that don't. Am I the biggest advocate for people pouring a ton of money and then, that's going to be the path? It wasn't my personal path, so I can't per se that it does or doesn't work. I mean, it clearly does. People have done it, but I think it's more so figuring out who has the pipeline into the role, right? Kind of similar to what I used to tell students when we went on tours. Parents' number one question would be, where do your alumni end up? Because they're thinking, if we pour all this money into this kid going, I hope that they're going to. What's the outcome? So you want to ask those kinds of questions, I think, before you commit to a program. But if you're breaking in, relationship building, definitely connecting the dots when you do have those interviews. And then the third thing I would say is somewhat interview related, but also just somewhat people related. Like, what's the outcome? You've got to think of where you can best help companies. And I think that's something that's also overlooked. People want a lot of opportunities in tech, and I get it. I for sure get it. The company hiring you, though, is also trying to figure out, what do you bring that's going to help what we've got going be better? So in some ways, you do have to keep up with what's happening. You don't have to keep up with all the terms, but you got to think about, if I'm having somebody that wants to interview at Oracle, can you tell me what some of Oracle's big focuses have been the past 6 months? Because if you're asking for a job there, if you can connect how what you're doing helps them make more money on that end, dude, they're definitely going to be giving you a lot more attention. So some of that too, I feel like people can just pay a little bit more attention to. There's tons of opportunities, but that to me is what I'm noticing a little bit more in this environment compared to when I first started. Is there's more work on your end you got to do to connect those things together. So hopefully that's helpful in some way.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of good points. I was just going to say for viewers, if you want a good example of someone who had a story of how they were able to go from nothing in terms of, not being in tech at all and kind of getting in through pure just relationship building. Look at one of my old interviews with Shaquille Matherin. Guy did the same thing, everything that you were mentioning, Tyrice.
Awesome.
He and I still talk with him all the time. He established a relationship with me. He didn't just say, "Hey Dom, how do I get into tech?" or "Hey Dom, can you refer me?" and I still look at him as like someone that I've just built a relationship with because he checks in on me, I check in on him, but it's a mutually beneficial relationship where I learn new things from him, like things how he's using like AI to do things, like things that again we're trying to use, but these young different generations are doing things or thinking about things differently. So it's very fascinating. But I think this is a good part for us to end this right now. But I guess just to ask, like, how can our viewers get in touch with you?
Awesome. I'm on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out. I do my best to respond as quickly as I can. I'm in the same season Dom is with learning how to be dads to, sons growing up in the world. So we got an 8-month-old. But yeah, no, generally LinkedIn's great. And people can DM me, they can, reach out. And I'm always a fan of having conversations like this. So I really enjoy video chats. I don't mind hopping on the phone. And, I'm here to help. Like I tell people, one of my big goals of why I love this is like when I started, I was fortunate to run into some people that became mentors of mine that, helped me learn the tech space, and they had 40 years of experience. Not everybody has that. So I can never pay them back because of that, but I can now pay it forward. And I'm very much that guy that if you reach out to, like, would have no problem helping wherever I can. So yeah, that's how we can keep in touch.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Tyrice. For everyone out here, all the tech explorers, please like, share with your network, and subscribe. We do this every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. And, comment below and let us know the favorite tip that you learned from Tyrice. So thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.